Donovan, welcome back to the second episode. And we had a very interesting conversation talking about human behavior in the first episode. And this episode, I'd like you to relate that as to how it would have an impact on the cultural and political impacts with respect to the behavior. Right?
Yep.
So there's so much which is happening in our environment.
Mm.
So I'd let you start the conversation, and then I would interrupt and ask you follow-up questions. Go ahead,
Sure,
Donovan.
sure. So, yeah, thank you, Sujit. Right, in the first episode, what we discussed was basically human factors from a microscopic perspective. So we are discussing individual user behaviors, etc. So now, if you think about it from a cultural and political aspect, now think of this as human behavior in aggregate, right?
Mhm.
Because culture essentially is what happens when you bring people together, because they share certain similarities in practices, etc. And arguably, you would use a similar definition, though not entirely the same, for political effect as well, right? So I think now we're not going to look towards large scale behavior, if I may. And given what I like to talk about as an analogy, given my physics degree, right, is that
Right.
first episode we talk about small systems. We talk about how a particle behaves. Now we talk about an ensemble of particles, right? So it's more statistical, right? So before we get into the interruption or questions, now what we're going to say here is not going to be confined specifically to a certain political agenda or cultural bias, because fact of life is that with large systems, we will see a spectrum of behavior. So what I'm going to talk about, it's mostly aggregates.
Yeah.
Yep. So
Right.
that's that.
Yeah.
Mm.
So Donovan, something which we started seeing the last few days
Mhm.
is about the decision about the CVE database,
Yes.
right? I mean, that became a hot topic at a certain point of the day, and then kind of it tapered down again,
Mm.
right? So we are seeing certain shifts in conversations or certain shifts in the way security would be looked at, right? So
Yep.
how do you relate that to either to culture, or would you look at as a digital divide, or would you take it part of political or a geopolitics? How do you see this?
Maybe I will first start by talking about the whole issue with the CVE database first, because
Sure.
I think that's what many security professionals relate to. And then I
Yep.
will try to extrapolate it to broader security developments that link to, I would talk about political developments, right? So
Yeah.
let's look at the CVE database first, right? So, I mean, we all know what happened was that in a broader political landscape of the Americans wanting to, I would say, save federal funding. Okay, at least that is the narrative in the US today. Uh, what happened was that the cybersecurity functions were also one of the functions that were affected, and so that happened. And I think one preliminary comment that is probably important to highlight is that actually lots of our cybersecurity work that we do today relies quite a lot on open source material, information made public for the good of all. And this is quite important because, for one, in cybersecurity, we face a very asymmetric situation, right? Your threat actors don't tell you they attack you, right? So basically, you don't really have very much information about your threat actors. And they thrive actually with the absence of information. So basically, if you can weaponize some CVEs, you don't tell people about it, right? The attackers have the upper edge because you don't know what's going to hit you, right? So that's that. So there's a information asymmetry aspect. So broadly, I would say anything that results in greater information sharing helps the cybersecurity community, at least helps the good guys like us, right?
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so, to some extent, one might even think of this as a public good, though I use the terms public good here quite loosely, because while I take this from a microeconomics definition, meaning to say, like street lights and stuff, right? You basically don't consume street lights. But here it's a bit, the definition is a bit less strict because you can choose not to consume cybersecurity products, but it's publicly available. Now, the thing is, we build so much around public information so that when someone says, hey, the database is going to stop being updated, we get really worried, and for good reason. Now, I think thankfully CISA came in to say, hey, let's do some emergency funding for this to keep this going, etc. But I think there are some broader implications that we have to think about politically. And that is as follows. Actually, um, cybersecurity and politics are quite intertwined in a number of ways. And I'll
I see.
explain this from first a philosophical angle. If we look at war and peace, some people would say they're two sides of the same coin. I would take a view that it is somewhat of a spectrum. And if you have friends who have worked in foreign affairs bureaus and or agencies where they look at the relative friendliness between like two nation states, right? Basically, think about like relationship between U.S. and China, for example, whether or not you would see that it goes in a spectrum, whether the best of buddies, or in the worst extrema, you're in a hot war, right? But then there are always many different intricacies and nuances in between. And I think in foreign policy, they call it something like the staircase of escalation. So if you're not happy with someone, you will escalate bit by bit. Unfortunately, cyber operations falls somewhere in this spectrum. And because it falls somewhere in this spectrum, cybersecurity practitioners like myself do need to make sure we are kept updated on political happenings because this links to threat intelligence, right? Who is
Correct.
likely to attack you kind of depends on who you are. And who you are, your identity may make some threat actors somewhat unhappy with you. Like for example, if say you told people that you do lots of business with Israelis, lots of financial transactions, surely you will get certain kinds of threat actors, right? Whereas if
Mm.
you say you do business with lots of Russians, then your profile will differ. So that's one aspect. That's the political aspect, right? But I thought I also spend some time talking about culture because culture is also quite important. And I think here I would look at it from a different angle. So recently I was in Japan, and Japan
Mm.
is a very, very interesting country, right? In Japan, on one hand, we have lots of very cool technology. You have robots that will make beds for you. I wish I had that in Singapore, right? Uh, you have, I think Switch 2 just came out, so they have the pre-release. So you have very nice gaming stuff. Now, on the other hand, I've also encountered my fair share of websites that don't even use HTTPS and accept credit card payments.
Okay. That's interesting.
So when I was speaking to some Japanese counterparts, they said, yeah, it has been a very hard time educating Japanese folks to come up to speed with cybersecurity best practices because, for the lack of a better word, they operate in such a high trust environment that they feel that no one's going to hack them. But that's obviously not true because
Mm.
if you look at the geopolitical situation,
Yeah.
well, no one's going to care about national borders when we talk about threat actors, right? You're connected to
Yeah.
the internet. Basically, anyone can reach you,
Just a click away.
right? Exactly. So it's so weird because Japan is a high trust society, right? I mean, you go there, you don't need to worry that you'll be pickpocketed, unlike in some parts of the world where pickpockets are a real risk. But sometimes this trust is misunderstood, but got carried over to the digital world, and that can be quite scary.
That's a very interesting
Mm.
take, Donovan, because typically we do not, compare the physical world with the cyber world. But the
Yes.
analogies which you, or the examples
Mm.
which you shared, it makes me wonder, what should we be doing as humans? Where do we start the change? That's a challenge, right? And earlier we also spoke about the unpredictability nature of the humans. That these two, when they come together, the situation becomes much more complex.
Yes, exactly. So I think change management is very important because this also links back to culture. Some cultures are more enterprising, they are more eager to adopt change. So if we look at some of the global leaders in cybersecurity today, no surprises who they are, and there is some correlation between the global leaders in cybersecurity and the extent to which they're willing to embrace change. So, who are they? For example, you have the United States, you have the Chinese, you have the Israelis, right? I just like a few examples, right?
Yeah.
Why? Because if you look at the way the economies are run, right? Yeah, the US, they will innovate. The Israelis, they innovate because of the perception of an existential issue, right? For the Chinese, very interesting. So the Chinese are a very interesting community because if you go to conferences, for example, you find that, hey, you don't see Chinese researchers present their work. And that's because they have decided quite early on that look, and this is a political decision that they're not going to be sharing very much cyber because they feel that cybersecurity is to them a certain strategic advantage, and that they will innovate on this front because
Mm.
they are willing to accept that because it's a strategic imperative, they're willing to change. Now we talked about Japan. If you're familiar with Japan, you would also know that they are one of the most conservative societies when it comes to the way they do business, when it comes to the way that they look at tradition. I mean, and we cherish that, right? We go to Japan as tourists and we like to see the Shinto shrines, we like the food, we pay more for the traditional vibe. Now, that doesn't play very nicely in the digital world because the digital world changes so rapidly. And because it changes so rapidly, you sometimes find that it is quite hard to keep up. And I think you might agree with me that even when we do cybersecurity, we would realize that the way the technology changes is sometimes so fast that the only way to keep up is by relying on a network of professionals who are experts in their different fields and to keep up with them.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
Well, Donovan, my takeaway are a couple of things. I think
Yeah.
we have to definitely look at the political and the cultural
Yes.
angle
Hmm.
and maybe start looking at how do we change our perception, right?
Hmm.
From assumed trust to assume whatever you call it, right? So you cannot, put a name to that right now. I'm not able to think of a specific name, right? So we probably the cultural values we have in our societies cannot be equated to a cyber trust, right? So while there's so much of conversations which are happening globally about the digital trust, and I think every digital trust conversation should also take into consideration the cultural, the political, the societal cultural values, right, as to how they look at uh, the security or even the transactions they have would also play a significant role. So,
Yeah.
Donovan, thank you so much for your time for having this conversation. So, I would invite you for the episode 3, where we would talk about community manipulation. How are communities manipulated, or how is manipulation used in the modern digital world? So, viewers, I hope you had a good understanding of the importance of cultural and political values. And I think even in your own organizations, different people from different communities, and if you're a multinational organization, you would have different people from different countries working together. And you would also have experience that their view on certain things would differ, right? So it is important, especially when you build your cybersecurity policy framework, to take into consideration the cultural values as well. So, with that note, I request all of you to subscribe, hit the button, follow us, and share your views if you have any, and we would be happy to take them on board. Thank you so much and see you around.